Hey guys, Mike with Long Range at the Lilies here at Leupold headquarters in Beaverton, Oregon, with Mike Baccellieri, also known as Buck, to learn how a scope works. So if you guys watched our previous installment, I just built this Mark V HD here at the headquarters with adult supervision, thank goodness. And don't worry, it's going home with me, so you guys won't have to worry about getting one that I built. But I think a lot of people, Mike, you know, it's this black magic tube that we look through and things get bigger and smaller, like magic occurs, and outside of that, I don't think a lot of people know much about the way scopes work. So, you know, you're kind of the expert, so thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I just need you to tell me everything about this magic tube that
bow to stern.
Yeah, there we go.
Oftentimes we'll talk like in our classes, and you've sat through some of the classes, we talk about this being a lot like an alternator.
Okay.
And, you know, like when you're that backyard grease monkey, you say, what makes an alternator work? Well, the magic smoke. Don't let the magic smoke out, because it's JFM. It's just freaking magic inside of there, right? And we know that when we grab this and I do this, my bullet lands in a different spot if I'm utilizing the center of the reticle. Or if I do this, things grow and shrink, and then things go into focus and out of focus. And that's about it. I mean, at the end of the day, we know that we can adjust a diopter here, and outside of that, this thing just needs to be able to work its magic every time. And it's interesting talking about different scope manufacturers, or I should even say different scope brands. And there's a lot to the scope industry because there's so much JFM going on in here that it's really unknown. And on top of that, things can get marketed certain ways when you think your scope is doing one thing, or there's kind of the perception, or somebody's told you this is how a scope works. It's kind of like years ago, a lot of old timers would say, well, once you dial up, you got to smack on the objective bell, right? And they tell you to smack it. And then anybody who's ever ran an ACOG know that it takes like a 20-pound sledge to get it zeroed, right? Well, why is that? Why? And then I call it that Joe Dirt moment. Like, why is a posi track working the back end of a Buick? It just does, right? So why is it that smacking this all of a sudden allows your tracking to be accurate, right? Why is it that if I don't smack it on older scopes or brand new scopes out of the box, why it doesn't work? It's a lack of understanding about what's going on inside here, and when light enters this scope, or when I make a mechanical adjustment, how does that translate optically and reframe the relationship we have with this optical system and the optical system God put in our heads.
Okay.
So managing an optical system is a lot like, it's realistically a lot about managing refraction rates, and as light and colors come into a scope, they're just spread out. You have lights and colors, you don't have anything specifically you're looking at, and what we're doing is we're taking all those lights and colors and we're refracting them down to a finite point of convergence. And at that point of convergence, a real image is created. That's an image that we can see, we know we're looking at, and then that's where we can start to dissect things about a good scope or a bad scope from a shooter's perspective. What's the contrast resolution look like? How clear is that image? Do I have aberrations or stray light coming in, washing it out with glare, or do I have what we call scope shadow? It's actually called vignetting. Am I getting that black shadowing coming in?
Right, the ring.
The ring, yeah, the ring, or, you know, covering up, mooning out half of the scope, or whatever it is, eclipsing part of it. So this all happens with managing light, with refraction rates, managing colors, with lens coatings. There's a ton of stuff that goes in there we probably don't have time to get into, but essentially what happens is, in this system, light comes into your objective lens. It goes through your objective lens pack, and on this scope you've got more than one objective lens. So it goes through your objective lens, your series of objective lenses, and gets refracted down. Once we get to this point here, we have inside here our side focus elements. So while we're playing with the side focus, and a lot of people would call that a parallax knob, it's not a parallax knob, it's a side focus knob, and the byproduct of focusing your system properly is that you rid the system of parallax.
Right.
And in regards to a shooter's perspective, parallax just isn't that important of a factor. We can get into that at another time, or on another video series or whatever, because that's a whole nother class that we can talk about. But parallax affects us up close more than out far.
That's what I was going to say. I think that's one of those common myths that people are like, oh, long range shooting, like the further out you get, the more critical it is your parallax works, but it's actually the inverse of that.
It's exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the problem is that you get out to a certain distance, and we could go through the numbers, but If I've got this scope set at 150 yards, if my side focus is set dead on at 150 yards, and then I shoot out to say 300 yards, and then I cock my head as far as I can to one side of it, what I've done is I've forced myself to look diagonal through the optical system. So at 300 yards, while we're set at 150, the worst I could possibly miss my target by, or the most parallax could come into play, would be half the width of the objective lens. So 25, well, this would be 27 millimeters.
Okay.
Or 28 millimeters. It's a 56 millimeter objective.
There we go.
So
math.
So yeah, math on the fly, on camera. So 28 millimeters. Well, there's only 25.4 millimeters in an inch. So at 300 yards, if I have my side focus set at 150, just because we've doubled the distance, if I jack my head all the way over to one side, completely black out the scope and look through a little teeny sliver of light and look as diagonal as I can, meaning induce the most amount of parallax I possibly could at 300.
Okay.
Since we're double the distance of where the side focus is set, the farthest I could miss my shot is half the width of the objective lens.
So is that same principle true if I'm shooting at 600 but dialed to, my parallax is set
at 300, you're double the distance, and so you jack your head all the way over. The worst you could induce parallax for is half the width of the objective lens diameter.
So 20, or what did we say?
28 millimeters
at 600.
At 600, but the problem is, or not the problem, something to realize is this entire system has been collimated at optical infinity, meaning everything is set at optical infinity. So that's right around, for a Mark V system, it's right around 600 yards. So once you get 600 or optical infinity and beyond, you're in what's called the circle of least confusion, meaning the amount of room you really have to move back and forth where you can throw that reticle off from your image beyond that, because once you hit optical infinity, all of your lights and colors are entering the optical system perfectly linearly. Once you get closer, they enter at an angle, causing a distorted relationship between your reticle and the image. But once you get out past optical infinity, that basically goes away. And so beyond 600, it's really challenging, if not darn near impossible, to induce a parallax miss or a parallax shift. But if you're zeroed or you're set up so that you're focused at 300 and you're beyond optical infinity, it's going to look like soup. It's going to look like that worst day of mirage. So you're going to need to play with this simply out of focus. And what's going to happen when you get your image in focus? You rid the scope of parallax. So this is all about focus, right? So as the lights and colors come through your objective lens pack, they come down and they hit your side focus element, which is the lens system inside here. After that, they get refracted down again, and that's where they hit that point of convergence, where all your lights and colors come down on that point of convergence, and that real image is created for you to see and for your brain to actually understand what you're looking at. From there, they go through your erector assembly, and they come back out and they go through another entire lens pack, which is your erector assembly. Your erector assembly has three basic jobs. We'll get into those in a second. But they go through your erector assembly, then they refract back down again to a finite point of convergence. Now, here's the thing to remember. We all talk about scopes. Is that a first focal plane or a second focal plane scope?
Right.
The reality is this is both a first and second focal plane scope. When we refer to whether it's a first or a second focal plane scope, we're referring to where the reticle is housed. Because when that light and color bundle come down to that finite point of convergence, the first plane in the scope where that happens is about right here. So if your reticle is housed here, it's a first focal plane scope. Then they spread back out again, they go through your erector assembly, then they refract down again to that secondary point, or the second plane in the scope where a finite point of convergence takes place. That's a second focal plane scope if your reticle is there.
Okay, that makes sense.
And so when you're looking at the erector assembly, sorry, back up for a second. Once they hit that second point of convergence, they spill out at the back of the scope in a definitive disk of light called an exit pupil. All right. Once that exit pupil comes out, that's measurable, and that's very, very easily seen. And I don't know if the camera will be able to pick it up. You'll be able to see it, and you've seen this before in one of our classes. But you can look at the disk of light on the back end of the scope right here. And as I change and I go down in magnification, that grows, and as I go up in magnification, it shrinks back. I'm sorry. Yeah, as I go up in magnification, it shrinks back down.
Right.
So basically what we're doing at that point is we're taking the magnification that we're on, dividing that into the objective lens diameter, and that's the diameter of our exit pupil.
So that's a finite thing. Like, it can't be you know, when guys say, I want the largest exit pupil, I want whatever, that is a function of how the scope is built, and you can't just make it bigger.
You can't just grow. It's not something you can tune. You have your high end of magnification divided into your objective lens diameter, and that gives you your exit pupil. Okay. So I'm on 25 power here. We're going to change this up so math is easy. We're going to pretend that this is a 50 millimeter objective. 25 goes into 50 twice. So you have a 2 millimeter exit pupil on 25 power.
Okay.
And then if I were to drop this down to 10 power, 10 goes into 55 times, so you'd have a 5 millimeter exit pupil. Now, the math doesn't exactly line up that way. And the reason for that is the math is accurate on max magnification. And the reason for that is as you dial down, you're no longer using the entirety of the objective lens to draw light. So the math doesn't perfectly equate once you're off max magnification. But it's close enough for you and I to say, I'm on 10 power, I should have about a 5 millimeter exit pupil, right? For a shooter's, it's almost like a MOA is 1 inch. It's not, but that's a shooter's math and it works well.
So would you say, and forgive me if I mess this up, let's say I'm shooting it, how I relate it to as a shooter. If I'm in a compromised position, I'm having trouble getting a line behind the scope is going to be more forgiving to get behind on a lower
magnification
than a higher magnification.
Because you're growing that exit pupil, so if you're not dead center behind that optic and you're slightly offset, your exit pupil will grow and you'll have more room before we start to see that vignetting or scope shadow.
Okay.
So there's a direct correlation there, and this is important to understand, especially on the military law enforcement side or anybody utilizing night vision, so night hunters for predator hunters or whatever, is think about the size of your exit pupil. So that's that definitive disc of light that spills out that I can operate inside of to have what we call a full scope of light. So imagine that this is a 5 millimeter exit pupil and my eye is dilated to say 3 millimeters in the middle of the day. Well, that means I've got 2 extra millimeters, probably 1 on each side depending on where, if I'm located dead center, 1 millimeter in any direction, so 2 total that I can move before I start seeing that scope shadow. We call it scope shadow creeping in. It's actually our eye creeping out is what it's doing. It's our eye leaving the exit pupil and seeing that vignetting. So an important thing to remember if you're a night shooter and you use some sort of clip-on inline system here is that the human eye on average max dilates to 8 millimeters at night. Well, PVS 30, which has been standard issue in the Army for years and years and in the Special Operations side of the Marine Corps for a long time, they say you cannot dial up your day optic behind it above 10 power, recommended no more than 8 because you'll start to pixelate and make the image all grainy. So if I have a scope and I'm on 10 power and it's a 50 millimeter objective, I have a 5 millimeter exit pupil, but my eye has been dilated to 8 millimeters. So when I get behind that scope, I'm going to have a big fat black donut of vignetting because my eye pupil doesn't fit inside of that exit pupil.
That makes a lot of sense. So I've shot some thermal and some night vision at night, and I've experienced that myself.
Yeah.
And I kind of naturally just played with the power to get it down to be a little more forgiving. That makes a lot of sense.
And what that does is that grows, giving you a larger surface area for your eye pupil to fit inside of. Now, give it 30 seconds and the light spilling through from that PVS 30 will shrink your eye pupil and you'll be good. But if you have to get down and take a rapid shot and need to be on a higher power, people say, I need a bigger objective, I want more light. This doesn't give you more light. If you grow this objective lens diameter, it doesn't give you more light. It gives you a larger exit pupil.
Okay.
And that larger exit pupil, especially in a low light scenario, can give us the perception that we're getting more light in the scope because we don't get what I call optics claustrophobia, where that amount of exit pupil is collapsing down around our eye pupil. The more this grows, the more room we have to move and the more spacious it feels with more light. But it's not more, it's just spread over a larger area.
I think that is another one of Grandpappy's old optic myths. You want the largest bell possible to get the most light.
The most light, yeah, absolutely. And main tube is another factor in that a lot of people said for years will give you more light. A larger main tube will not give you more light, and that's what we're going to talk about when it comes to the erector assembly here.
All right. Do you want to just head into that, or where do you want to go next?
Yeah, no, that's great. So probably one of the most critical aspects of this optic or this system, because it's one that we manipulate all the time, is going to be your erector assembly. And inside a scope, the erector assembly is the inner tube system right here, and you can see you've got basically a front lens pack, a rear lens pack, and then you've got 2 erector cells.
And that's these gray lines here, right?
Yep, those are a lens cut in half or a lens pack cut in half. When you see them really thick and you can see a seam in there, that's called a doublet. That's 2 lenses glued together. Well, they're actually chemically welded together, but they're precision ground and chemically welded together. And as lights and colors go into an optical system or into a lens, based on the curvature of the lens, whether it's concave, convex, and what the radius is, they're going to refract, right? So it's going to change the angle of light. As they exit that lens, it's going to refract a secondary time. So by putting a doublet together, you have 4 refraction rates in a very small amount of time inside of the scope.
Okay.
All right. So you've got basically 2 tubes that this is comprised of. You've got your inner tube, which is your erector tube, and then the outer tube, which is called a cam tube. And those 2 erector cells, or those 2 lens packs in there, they move forward and back inside your erector assembly, and they magnify and demagnify, and here's the small print, the dependent clause of that statement, they magnify and demagnify everything in front of them. So if your reticle is housed in front of them, not only will your image grow and shrink, your reticle will grow and shrink in perfect relationship to your image, hence the first focal plane scope, and that's the attraction to the first focal plane. If your reticle is housed behind them, only your image will grow and shrink, and your reticle will stay a stationary size, and all your subtensions on your reticle, whether those are mils or minutes or ballistic drops or whatever they are, those will only be accurate at max magnification.
Okay.
I know that there's a couple of bench resting scopes out there where specific to bench rest, where on max magnification there's like a line or an indicator and you come back, now your reticle's accurate. But for 99.999% of scopes out there,
it's
max magnification will make sure that your reticle values or your subtensions in the reticle are accurate on a second focal plane optic.
Yeah, so if you have a second focal plane optic and you adjust your magnification, you're trying to do holdovers, you're going to have a hard time unless you know specifically what the ratio is.
Correct.
On certain powers. I have seen guys try and do that. They'll figure out their danger space, or they'll maximum point blank range, and they'll say it's this, but then they'll adjust their second focal plane scope magnification, and now all of that data is
goes away.
Yeah.
Yep, it goes away.
Okay.
So something you can do, there's going to be a line on like this Mark V. You're going to come down there and there's a line. At that line, you're on half magnification. So if you line your dot up and your reference point with that line, and this was a second focal, now you just double the value of your subtensions.
I had no idea why that line was there. I've been shooting these for years.
Yeah. So that's what that line is for. It gives you the exact point where you can draw. So if this was second focal plane, it's a 5 to 25. We drop it down. That lines you up exactly where you need to be on 12.5 power. Because right now you've got a 14 and 11. You'd be Forrest Gumping your way to try more or less-ish, right? But if you're doing holdovers and you need to be accurate, right now what I can do is, instead of holding over, say, 6/10, so if I give you a wind call and you're on half mag and this was a second focal plane, and I said, all right, dude, I need you to hold 6/10 left, you would hold over 3/10, because now what we've done is we've effectively doubled the value of the subtensions in your scope. Because what you've done is you have your reticle, we'll say these are lines on a reticle, and your image, and what I've done is that's covering up a certain amount of that image. Well, when I shrink the image to half power, now these are covering up double the amount, so each subtended value is worth double. So your erector assembly has 3 major jobs that we need to be aware of. The first and foremost is where it gets its name. By the time you hit the first focal plane in your scope and that point of convergence takes place, your image is actually upside down.
Okay.
So for anybody that is new to this, you need to understand, well, you don't need to, I guess it doesn't matter to you.
So
but
we're talking right here.
Yep, up right at the front of your your adjustment assembly or your adjustment housing here, because your reticle is on the very front of your erector assembly, and your erector assembly goes from about right here to right here.
And that's this tube.
That's the dual tube there.
Here, yep.
Right? So at the first focal plane, your image is upside down.
Okay.
So if you have a grid reticle, like anything from an H59 to a Tremor 3 or a CCH or a PR2, PR2 is getting really popular. If it's a first focal plane with a PR2, the PR2 is installed upside down. So everything matches, and then the erector assembly, that's where it gets its name, it erects your image right side up.
Right.
So that's the first thing that it does. So as the lights and colors cross here, they come here and they're going to crisscross over. Your whatever color was on top is now on bottom. They flip-flop the image for you, bringing it right side up. The second job of this, and this is critically important to us, is they re-zero the scope. So back here, your erector assembly is housed in almost like a ball joint would be on like a steering system, like a suspension system or a steering system or whatever. There's a ball joint, it's captured. That's called your pivot seat. The rest of it can flop, move up, down, left, and right, and it's held in place by your adjuster pins and your spring, your erector springs underneath it. So that's where it's captured, and it's held in place by that as you drive it up and down. So as we spin this up or down, we're actually moving the erector assembly up, down, or left and right, and we're re-zeroing the scope. Now,
Okay.
I might take this and I might dial up, I don't know, 4.6 mils, and that, depending on your caliber, that could be a 600-yard shot, right, or an 800-yard shot, depending on how fast you're moving or whatever. I haven't loosened the set screws and slipped the scales back down to the 0 point, but I have effectively re-zeroed my scope. So
Yeah, so when you say re-zero my scope, most guys would think of that as just dial.
just dial.
Okay.
Yep. So when you dial up, down, left, or right, you're effectively re-zeroing every time you do that.
That makes a lot of
And
sense.
yeah, and so that's the secondary job, or not secondary, they're all equally important, but one of the jobs, the second job of the erector assembly is to re-zero the scope. And then the third job is to magnify and demagnify. So as we spin our power selector ring, as you can probably see on here, your power selector ring is actually, which side is it here? What are we looking at on the scope? That's the left side. Oh, so it would be right up here, so you can't see it on this cutaway,
it's a
because this is
top-down.
a top-down view. Your power selector ring is located with a connecting dowel pin or a drive pin to your cam tube, which is your outer tube. And I don't know if you're gonna be able to pick it up on the camera, but you got two slots there. And then these are, and that's actually located on the other side, those are a continuation of helical cuts in that cam tube. So as you spin this, what ends up happening is that tube rotates, and the helical cuts that are milled all the way through there, those drive pins move forward and back, and they move your erector assembly cells, or your lens packs for your erector assembly forward and back, or closer or further from each other, and those magnify and demagnify everything in front of them. Okay, so that's another thing important to remember is this erector assembly. It zeroes my scope, it makes sure that I'm seeing the world right side up, as well as it magnifies and demagnifies everything in the optic. So like on the old fixed 10 powers, like the Army had the M3 Alpha on their sniper weapon system, the Marine Corps had the Unerdal, right? This was very similar to what it is now, but those lens packs didn't move. They were fixed, and people wonder why a fixed power scope is so durable. Well, there's just a ton of less moving parts.
Yeah, it's just simpler.
Much simpler design, very robust, but you miss out the opportunity to have a variable powered scope, right? So that is your erector assembly, and aside from manipulating your side focus or your diopter, and this is really a one-time manipulation. Once you first get the optic and you're setting that up, aside from manipulating this, your side focus, you do distances to make sure that everything's focused, but the erector assembly, when you play with your adjustment housing, up, down, left, and right, zeroing the scope, re-zeroing the scope, this is probably one of the most critical aspects that we build our relationship with the scope utilizing. And so that tube assembly inside of there moves up, down, left, and right for us, and as we spin our power selector ring, it shifts forward and back internally, growing and shrinking what we're looking at.
It's kind of the heart of the scope.
It is, very much so.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, very much so. It's what we use constantly, and we constantly interface with the scope. Now moving back from there, we've got our power selector ring, and everybody knows what this is. We spin it and things grow and shrink inside of the scope, and then we finish this scope out with a doublet and a singlet for the ocular lens pack. This is your ocular housing, this is your ocular lens pack, and from there the lights and colors spill out and create that uniform disc of light called the exit pupil. That's where we really start to build a relationship with the scope. And something that is commonly misunderstood is the diopter adjustment. And what this is going to do is kind of the way I describe it for anybody out there is we've all handed a phone or a piece of paper or a book to somebody, or we've just seen them do it, and they grab it, and then what they do is they grab it and they move it away so that they can read it. And
I have recently started doing that.
yeah, so you're about 45 years old?
Yeah, there's a direct correlation to the amount of gray in my hair and how much I have to move things.
I wish that were the case for me. I started going gray at 10. But so that's exactly what's going on there. And it's the easiest example I have to give people because everybody knows that grandma does it or mom does it, or we're starting to do it, whatever it is, right? And about age 45 is when our eyes rapidly reduce how fast we can change shape of our eyeball. So this is why it's really challenging for a lot of young shooters. They get inside there, especially in the sniper community, because it's a bunch of 22-year-old kids made out of rubber, right? And they get inside of that scope, and then in the sniper community, you park behind that scope for a long period of time, and you're living through that optic for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden the headaches start. And we can't figure out why the headaches start, because everything seems right with the world.
Their eyes are struggling.
Their eyes have changed shape so fast, forced the reticle into focus,
right.
And then they don't realize that they're literally sitting there flexing their eyeball, causing this strain on their brain. So what we're doing by, the reason why I give this as an example is what we're doing by adjusting the diopter is this thing is physically moving forward and back, right? So from the distance of this ocular lens to the reticle, wherever that's located in the scope, whether it's here or here, we're doing this with our distance to that reticle for our individual eye prescription.
Okay.
So what'll happen is like both of your boys are young. How old are they?
18 and 22.
So I bet either one of those boys could set up a rifle and set up a scope, and the other one could jump on it and the reticle would be clear for them, because their eyes are so elastic still that they change shape. Where you and I'd get behind your scope and I'd be like, geez, and crow, you're blind. You know what I mean? I'd move it, or you'd get behind mine and go the opposite direction, because our eyes aren't doing that anymore.
Right.
So what happens is these younger shooters get inside of a scope and they're comfortable, everything, all is right with the world, everything gets focused for them, and then that brain strain starts. So what they have to do is really focus on adjusting this well, and it needs to be something that's really like there's some time spent doing it when you first get a new scope. So how I recommend doing that is backing this out all the way. If it just comes out, you need to send your scope in for warranty, right? It'll stop.
It's probably the one I built.
It's probably Mike built your scope, send it back to Leupold, and it's not under warranty because Mike built it. So that L is for Lily on this scope, not for Leupold. But so. Anyway, you back it out all the way, and then you get like a really well-lit background.
Bright blue sky.
Bright blue sky is great. If you're in a house, it can be hard to do because family photos or artwork. Just grab an 8.5 by 11 sheet of computer paper and put it in front of the scope, to where light's still getting in the scope. Doesn't matter if it's a foot or 2 feet or whatever. You're trying to get rid of anything inside of that scope that your eye can be attracted to other than the reticle. Okay. You want the only thing that your eye can focus on to be the reticle. And how I teach people to do this, I teach a cigar hold on it, and the reason for that is we've all looked through a scope when it's not on a gun and there's no cheek weld, so we're all fighting to try to get inside of it, right? So if you find an anchor point, just like an archer would, right, with their knocking point, just find an anchor point, get in that scope and get in it and out of it in, say, under a second to a second and a half. Get that bright background, get in it, out of it, and go, man, okay, that was blurry. You move it a little bit, get in it and out of it. Okay, it's still blurry, in it and out of it. Where you and I are old enough to where we can almost park behind it, be like, no, it's blurry, blurry. Okay, we're getting there, right? But these younger eyes that are still elastic, you can't give it time to change shape. So you do that until you got it set perfectly right where you want it to be, and then once you've got it dialed and you spend the time to do that with young eyes, then I highly suggest paint pen and mark that all the way across, so that if they pull it out of their range bag or like an Everly stock, if they're hunting, they can go, pre-fire check, right? Line that back up, and then they're good to go. The other thing to really remember about this, there's actually two other things regarding the diopter that I'd love to talk about. One is all of our eyes have a different diopter setting for day and night.
Okay.
So instead of having a bunch of paint pen lines on here, if you can get in the darkest part of the day possible, but you can still see your reticle in focus, and you're able to set up your diopter at that time frame of light, you're going to kind of have the best of both worlds for you. Okay. And it's going to optimize it for you. Not a big deal if you're like, if you've got a rifle that's only a PRS gun, right, or only an NRL gun. But if you've got a rifle that sometimes I hunt with that, sometimes I compete with that, or this is a sniper weapon system that's actually used for work, that becomes very, very important.
Okay.
So that's something to remember. And then the other thing is, I know that your show is called Long Range with the Lilies, but take a different turn for a quick second, and probably one of the fastest growing optics to put on an AR-15 right now is a low powered scope, like an LVPO, like a 1 to whatever, 1 to 4, 1 to 6, 1 to 8, name it. The thing about that is when we have a scope that's a low powered scope like that, and when I say low, what I mean is it goes all the way down low enough to where you don't need a red dot, because that scope can be utilized as a red dot, right?
Right.
If it goes down to a true 1 and it's marketed as a true 1, just like the erector cells moving forward and back while we spin our power selector ring, any lens inside of this scope moving forward and back will change your magnification.
Okay,
right?
makes
and
sense.
when you dial this and get this so that your reticle is perfectly clear because you're optimizing the effective focal length for your eye prescription, you're changing the magnification of the scope. Now, when you're on low power and it's on 5, you don't care whether it's 4.9 or it's 5.2. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant.
But if it's 1.2 or 1.8,
and you expect it to be a true 1, that's an issue.
Okay.
So the difference that I see between a scope like this and a 1 to something is that when we're on top power on that scope, we're not living behind it. Like this, I'll park even when I'm hunting. I'll sit there, especially on Coastal Range, Oregon. We are in a big open logging cut, and I'll be sitting there, and there's some buck or some elk that's dancing in and out of the tree line, and I'm watching it. I'm waiting for it to give me a proper shot, right, to minimize all of my variables. So I'm living through that scope. So hunter oftentimes will do the same thing. But on a low-powered scope where you've got a 1 to something, 99% of the time that's on 1 power and it's a gunfighter optic, and a law enforcement officer or a coyote hunter or whatever might zip it up and go, no, that's a cell phone, not a Glock, that's a non-combatant, right? But they're not living behind that scope.
Right.
So what's actually critical is to make sure that when you set up a diopter for a low variable scope, that you're actually making sure it's a true 1 power. Because the minimal amount of time you spend with that reticle, needing that reticle on high power, you can force that into focus and take a precision shot with it if need be, but then you're gonna go right back down to 1. And what do you need? You need the red dot of the illuminated reticle in there to gunfight with. Mm-hmm. So it's really important that when we talk about getting that cigar grip and getting up here and in and out and getting that reticle perfectly in focus, that's for a precision rifle application scope. When you have a 1, 2, whatever, I think it's much more important. And how I do it is I'll actually get my AR on my shoulder, right? And I'll hold it underneath like this, so my left eye or this side of my non-firing side is wide open. And I'll look at, I like to do license plates because definitive lines work for my eye really well, like letters, numbers, stuff like that.
Sure.
And I'll toggle in and out of the scope, and I will just simply make sure that the world in the scope and the world outside of the scope matches, yep. Right? And it's equal. So a little bit of a different style of diopter. Now, if you've got a 1 to something that's on a rifle like a 6 arc or something like that, and you're like, the only thing I do with this thing is kill coyotes, or it's my deer hunt rifle, focus on the reticle, right? Yeah. Make sure that it's a reticle focus. But as far as utilizing that as a do-it-all gunfighter rifle, it's really important to have that 1 power as a true 1. So anyway, just I know long range isn't, like, that's not something that
no, that's all really great stuff, and I don't think I've heard all of that. Like, I knew about the Diopter and the bright blue sky and focusing it for my eye and how important it's getting as I've gotten older. And I think the big one is, like, I see a lot of guys, you know, especially 2 days of a 2-day match, a 2-day PRS match. It is a lot of time behind that optic. Yeah. And it does, you know, start to induce that brain headache.
Sure.
But no, that was all great stuff. What else on this magic tube do you want to cover, Mike?
I did want to talk about, because there's still a ton of us that are kind of spillover from still learning from an older generation that had different information. And it's funny, you talk to a lot of the old timers, and you know, back when I joined the military in the 90s, they used to teach us that bullets would come out of the rifle and then drop due to gravity, and then like go gadget, like gain altitude, right? Like we just didn't know, we didn't know at the time, you know what I mean? And so it's interesting, but I want to go back to smacking the objective lens of the scope, or the objective bell of the scope when zeroing. And what ends up happening is we utilize a very expensive spring steel in our scopes. And the reason why we utilize it, it's incredibly expensive for us to be able to get a hold of and continue to use. But the reason why we utilize that spring steel as our erector springs is because the more it gets used, the less memory it retains. And there's a lot of guys out there, we all know him, his name's Dad or Grandpa or whoever, that pulls their rifle out, checks zero on it, shoots an animal, or takes 3 or 4 shots that season to shoot an animal and then finish it off, and then maybe deer season's over, now an elk, and then it goes back into a safe for a year. Well, I almost guarantee you, I haven't picked up my rifle in 2 months, my hunting rifle, but I guarantee you, or I shot it, I should say. I picked it up and humped a bunch in the woods and then got skunked this year. So I've picked it up, but I haven't shot it. So I haven't shot my rifle in 2 months. I guarantee you I could go grab that rifle right now, and you're like, hey, I have a shot, I need to take it 800 yards. Do you have a rifle capable of it? I'd be like, yep, let me grab that, let me pull out a dope card, you know what I mean, get my environmentals set up, and then we're good. It'd be good to go. The reason for that is because I continue to shoot it throughout the year, right? It is a hunting rifle, but I still shoot it because it's also a recreational gun for me. So the reason that we utilize that metallurgy is the more it gets used, the less memory it retains. And that's really important to remember.
Which is the opposite of the old school that was like, hey, don't touch my turrets, don't dial them because you'll wear them out and then they won't be accurate
That's exactly
anymore.
right.
Okay.
And so it's quite the opposite. So what ends up happening is when you get a brand new scope out of the box, or I said old or new is kind of the way I had phrased that. What I mean by old is if you have a scope that hasn't been used or shot, and it's Leupold. I can't speak to other manufacturers and what they're using, but if you have a scope that's been sitting in a safe for a year, or a scope that is brand new out of the box, guarantee you inside of that spring as it's trying to get moved is memory, and it's relaxed and gone into that memory spot. So the reason why guys tell you to smack it, right, is because what will happen is, and it doesn't happen on a bold adjustment. If I said, hey, Mike, come up 5 mils, right, it's not going to happen. It'll be fine. But if I say, hey, give me a 1/10, right, hey, give me 2/10, those super finite adjustments, and you're like, it's not moving. So you come up another 1/10, not moving, another 1/10, not moving. Okay, boom, 1/2 mil, it pops. Well, what happens is when that spring is rested and it's got memory, and you're asking the erector to come away from it, you're asking it to catch up to the erector. So what these other old timers would say is smack it, and it jogs the spring and brings it back up. And so that's still a very useful tool. I mean, it works, and what a lot of people have said is, well, I don't know why it works, it just does, right? It's that Joe Dirt moment. That's why I say it's a Joe Dirt moment. Why does it work? Well, you're asking the erector assembly to come away, smacking the scope, jogging the system, and bringing the spring up to it. So if I need you to come up 2/10 and you're like, man, I haven't shot this scope in a year and a half, it would be more accurate for you to come up like 1.2, and then, actually we'll try to go down there, 1.2 up, and then come back down 1. Right now, we're giving it a bold adjustment, giving it room for the spring to catch up, and then driving back down to the spring.
I have heard that method too. Drive past it and then come back to it.
It works very, very good. Now, a lot of people assume that's due to lash in the amount of movement with this, right? A lot of people think that, oh, you're taking out the lash and bringing it back down and soaking up the lash inside the gear mechanism. It's not what's going on. You're simply getting the spring to catch all the way up and then driving back down to it. So, when we talk about, this is actually kind of a good segue into what I call scope break-in. It's probably one of the biggest discussions in the long-range world is how do you break in your barrel? Is barrel break-in still needed? Is it necessary? Is it a myth? Cold bore shot, clean bore, blah, blah, blah.
We're not touching that in this one.
I don't plan on it. I don't want to do that. Call someone else. But we do have a scope break-in period. So when you get a brand new scope out of the box, the first thing that needs to happen is take your elevation and windage, dial all the way up and all the way down, and do that 20 or 30 times. Get all that manufacturing memory out of those springs. Go left, right, up and down with it, and really break those springs in good. The next thing you need to do is take your diopter and your power selector ring and your side focus, all of them, and spin them all the way in and all the way out. Their full range of motion, and get all the assembly loops spread out where it needs to go. We've all probably pulled a scope out of a box, went to move the diopter, and it was like, and it spun free, and you're like, oh, now it's fine. It's because all that assembly lube is just sort of stuck where it's at.
Right.
You get that stuff spread out, side focus, power selector ring, all that stuff. Get it working really, really well. The third thing I like to do is get my diopter set up while it's off of a gun, just because it's easier for me. And then the fourth thing I'd like to do, and this is completely optional, is put it on a mirror and optically zero it. Right. So putting
when
on
you
a mirror.
say that, can you describe that?
Yep, you bet. So optically zeroing is, we have two types of zeroing an optic. And I'm not talking about zeroing the rifle. We're talking about the scope being completely off a gun right now. And you can do it while it's on a gun too, but we're gonna optically zero the scope. So the two types of zeroing an optic are mechanically and optically. Now mechanically, what you could do is, remember, for those of us that are old, and we're in the military with only iron sights before optics were issued, is when we went to zero our irons, we'd have to take the rear iron sight, dial all the way one direction, count the clicks all the way back the other direction, then count them halfway back, because now you were centered on your zero movement of your windage, right? You can do that with a scope. You can take this and dial it all the way one direction until it bottoms out, count the clicks all the way back the other direction, then count them halfway back. You will be mechanically zeroed. And if you bias, and it doesn't matter if you start with elevation or windage, because you're in a round tube and a round tube. So if you're low, your windage only moves so much, but you can equal it out, and then you're centered, then go to your elevation, and then you'll mechanically center the scope. And if you buy a scope from Leupold, that's how it'll come out of the box. And the reason for that is because one of the last things we check before we ship a scope out is what we call post mechanicals. Make sure after it's gone through full assembly, full cleaning, waterproofing, baking, making sure it's gone through all of our assembly process. After that, the scope still has all the elevation and windage that has been marketed to you, because that might be part of the reason why you bumped to a 35 millimeter main tube from a 34, right? So when it comes to you, it will be mechanically zeroed. But then what we have is an optical zero. And even though everything in the scope has centered out as far as its movement goes, the optical system might not be perfectly aligned to itself.
Okay.
Right? So what we're doing at that point is we put this on a mirror, and a bathroom works really good for this. The reason for that is typically bathrooms have a thick glass mirror. They're usually well lit for either makeup application, hygiene, or medical stuff. And I can put that on that glass mirror, and when you look inside of that scope, whether it's down or horizontal, you're going to see two reticles. One is the actual, one is going to be a reflection of the actual, and when I move my elevation and windage, one will move, the other will not, and it'll stay stationary.
And you're trying to...
You overlay them on top of each other perfectly. Now you've optically aligned the system to itself. And this is an awesome troubleshooting tool. The reason why it's an awesome troubleshooting tool is because when you have a weapon system that will not stay zeroed or won't track properly, the first place our mind goes is something's wrong with the scope, right? Which makes sense, because this is our communication tool to what we desired as a result and what we actually got as a result. This is how we find all that information, and this is how we force the result that we want, right? So I think it's funny when people in the factory say, why does everybody think something's wrong with their scope? It makes me laugh because people aren't calling here about trigger problems. The only reason why they would call them is for scope stuff, right? So of course they do, but it makes sense if you think about it. This is our bridge between desired result and actual result downrange. So we blame this, and it could be this 100%, but there is a million other factors involved in this thing staying zeroed and tracking properly as well. You've got the rings, the base, the barreled action alignment, the marriage between the barreled action and the chassis or the stock, whatever you're using.
Oh yeah.
Right? I mean, you ever shot off a pair of Caldwell bipods and expected your gun to group properly? It's not going to happen. You know what I mean? It's like you might as well be on a boat. So we go out of the gate and attack the scope. Something's wrong with my scope. The system won't hold zero and it won't track properly, but it could be something entirely different. So what ends up happening is we optically zero this, and we have a reticle overlaid on top of another reticle, and everything's like perfectly in alignment with the center of the scope. We haven't zeroed the gun yet. So we put this on the gun, we level everything out, we mount it properly, torque everything to spec, then we go to zero it. So we're going to dial when we zero this. We're going to dial elevation, we're going to dial windage, and so if we were to put that after the gun was zeroed back on a mirror, your reticles would be offset from each other.
Sure.
So you'd still see both of them, but they'd be offset. So if all of a sudden you come to me and you're like, hey, system won't track, won't hold zero, I'm having problems, it's driving me crazy. I don't even have to take this off a gun. I carry, you've seen it, I carry a 3x3 little square mirror, and I set it on the side of a table, and I go like that, and I look down inside of it. Well, if I can see both reticles, it probably is something wrong with the scope. Okay. But if all of a sudden I can't find another reticle because you've had to dial so far off to get that reticle on paper, well, that means it's probably something below the scope, right? And what I mean by that is if you have your erector assembly, which is a round tube, and your main tube, which is in another round tube, and say you have to dial all the way one direction to get it zeroed for windage. Now you go to zero your windage, or your elevation. Well, we've already zeroed windage, but what happens to our windage? Because we're tracing inside of a radius of another tube. So all of a sudden now it won't track, won't hold zero. The problem wasn't the scope. The problem was something below the scope was so misaligned, I had to dial that thing so far out to be able to get it on paper and actually utilize it. So all of a sudden I put this on and I'm like, dude, I can't even find the other reticle. Okay, there's probably something wrong below the scope. Rings to base relationship, base to action, blah, 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 all the way down.
And just to be clear, because you see two reticles if you do the mirror test, doesn't mean there's something wrong with the scope.
Not
that
necessarily.
Could be completely normal.
No, that's check one.
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
But the check one isn't really about finding that reticle, it's about being able to not find the or not being able to find the reticle.
Right.
Because you're like, okay, now there's something wrong with the gun. And then you do it just like you would it with an injector, right? Okay, I think number 4 is misfiring, switch that with number 6, and if the misfire follows to number 6 cylinder, now I know I've got an injector issue. So at that point we pull this off a gun, out of the rings, into another known good system, right? In good rings, and you know that system's been shooting well, now we recheck the scope.
Yep.
But for you or me or somebody out there, well, you went on a tour, you've seen this place, right? The warranty department here is the smallest department in the company, just because I not to sound like we're the baddest in the world, which we are, but like we just warranty very few scopes, right? And so that's all good and well for you or me, but you and I both know when you turn something into your supply sergeant and say this needs to get warranted, you ain't never seen it again, ever, right? So the few tools that we can give our soldiers and Marines and airmen and sailors to be able to check their own gear in the field and say, okay, hold on, let's not send that scope back for warranty, let's do a couple more quick checks. That way they can continue to utilize that piece of gear is really important.
Yep.
So the mirror trick is actually a really neat tool, and obviously you don't tell SWAT dudes or military guys to carry glass mirrors in their kit, but you keep it in the team range bag. You know what I mean? So when you're out on the range, you're diagnosing, you're gathering data, whatever you're doing, you can pull that mirror out and utilize it real quick as you're troubleshooting your gear before you go down the range.
That's cool. I hadn't heard that one before.
Yeah.
Is there an advantage to optically zeroing versus mechanical zeroing, and does it matter?
I optically zero. One, mechanically zeroing is going to take you forever and a day, and two, there's no troubleshooting you can really. I mean, you can do that. You can mechanically zero the optic, and then after that, when you shoot, you can figure out, okay, I had to come X amount of minutes or mils or clicks to the right or up or whatever, and go, okay, I've removed this amount of the equation of usable elevation or windage that I have. But honestly, I don't think it's very relevant. I would say just optically zero it. It takes seconds, right? And then get it on the gun and then use it as a diagnostic tool if you need to. Okay. But it's a really usable troubleshooting technique, right? That can be very affordable. And speaking of that, when we talked about before, we were talking about how a larger objective doesn't bring you more light and a bigger main tube doesn't bring you more light. As I was talking about before, you're moving that erector up, down, left, and right. A bigger main tube just gives you more room to dial. That's the only benefit you have as a shooter, or I have as a shooter. Now, on the manufacturing side, yeah, it gives us more room to run electronics if it's an illuminated reticle, or more room to build the linkage for your side focus element inside of there. But it's from a shooter's perspective, the only benefit we're getting out of that scope is room to dial. So if you have a guy that say a hunter from the south. We don't stand hunt much. That's not a style we do. We hike mountains or whatever, but down there, they are constantly in a deer blind or a stand. It's like you go to Georgia, that's all they do. They go to Carolinas, that's pretty much all they do, right? So a really long shooting lane for those guys would be like 200 yards. Yeah. It's massive. So they're getting a 308 or a 708 or something like that, and they're just doing like a max point blank range zero. So if I tell you like, hey Mike, I know you're looking for a new scope, dude, you got to get this one over here. It's a bigger main tube. It's going to be better quality, more light transmission, all this stuff. What I'm actually doing is convincing you to spend money that are tools you're never going to use, because the only thing you're going to do is zero your gun and leave it on that max point blank range zero.
Yeah, those guys always steer towards like a 3 to 9 or something very simple.
Yes.
And what I found is the image on those simplified scopes tends to be brighter, tends to be whatever, because it doesn't have to travel through as many lenses.
Yep.
And they don't need that large main tube because they're not dialing.
Yeah,
so
they're not dialing.
It's simple, it's reliable.
And it's a gnarly number, like 98 some odd percent or whatever it is. I don't have the official number anymore. Years ago it was 98% of hunters will never shoot past 300 yards. So something to think about for anybody out there looking at this brand is if your scope doesn't have a side focus on it, it means it's been optically set up to be perfectly focused and parallax free at 150 yards. And the reason for that, and that's why I used 150 as a quick example before, the reason for that is because the 300 yard is kind of the limit of advance for most hunters. That means that whether they're shooting a target at 35 yards or they're shooting a target at 273 yards, this has been optimized for them from 0 to 300, and they're good to go. So they're going to have clarity. But you're exactly right. The more you complicate the system, the more you want to go to a higher zoom ratio, an 8 to 1, a 10 to 1 zoom. The higher you go, the more distortion you're going to cause. To counteract that distortion, you add lenses. That's another degrading medium of light and image quality coming into the scope. So that's why on those simple scopes, oftentimes you'll see incredible light transmission just because there's so few lenses.
And that's why high-end scopes with a wide magnification range that are very clear are so expensive.
Yeah, because the complications of managing that optical system and giving you that contrast resolution is a challenging process.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome stuff. What else you got for us? Is that about it?
I don't know.
I mean, my brain's pretty full.
Yeah, I mean, without that presentation that you've sat through, it's oftentimes it's easier with my animated slides, right?
Yeah.
I can kind of draw things out really well, but
no, I think you've given us a lot to think about. Like I could watch this 2 or 3 times and pick up something every time. So I genuinely appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. And guys, if you ever get a chance to train with Buck, he does run some training for Mill and LEO out there for Leupold, and he's a wealth of knowledge, obviously. So Buck, I greatly appreciate it, man.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. Guys, if you like what you see, make sure you like and subscribe, and we try to bring you more, educational content. The more education that's out there, the better the community is as a whole. So make sure you share it with your friends, and we'll see you out there.